Well, here we are again. It's great to see you all, and I hope that the last couple of days have been a great time of grace, first and foremost, but also of enjoyment and time to socialize and see each other and to hear some wonderful presentations. We're not over yet, and we have our final keynote address, our second keynote address of the conference this afternoon with Professor Christopher Ruddy, who is an associate professor of historical and systematic theology here at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Ruddy is a graduate of Yale College and the Harvard Divinity School and earned his doctorate in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. Focusing on ecclesiology and on the history and theology of the Second Vatican Council, he is an expert in the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, whose writing he first encountered whilst writing his own dissertation, and about which he wrote in an article called Beyond the Caricatures, assessing the legacy of Ratzinger Benedict XVI in Commonweal magazine in 2023. As he wrote there, quote, "Over time, the understandable focus on his papal renunciation will be outweighed by his theological and magisterial legacy." How could we not invite someone who wrote those words to come to speak to us at a conference about the legacy of Joseph Ratzinger? Professor Ruddy is the author of The Local Church, Tillard and the Future of Catholic Ecclesiology, and Tested in Every Way, The Catholic Priesthood in Today's Church, both published by Herder and Herder. And his writing has also appeared in numerous academic and popular journals, First Things, Theological Studies, and The Thomist, to name just three. He and his wife, Deborah, who I'm delighted is able to join us for the conference, are the parents of 4 sons, and I'm immensely proud to call Chris a colleague and both Chris and Deborah friends. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christopher Ruddy for his keynote address, The Priority of God as the Key to Joseph Ratzinger's Liturgical Legacy.
Well, I first want to thank Father James and Father Friel and the board of the Society for issuing the invitation to give this talk. It's a real honor. I know so many of you have been coming here for years or decades. I'm a relative newbie. I started coming in 2022, so I am still somewhat of a new kid on the block, but I'm very glad to be here today. The title of my talk is, I tweaked it a little bit, God First, the Priority of God as the Key to Joseph Ratzinger's Liturgical Legacy. To whom is the Eucharistic prayer addressed? My professor's question hung in the air, generating nervousness and even a little bit of fear among me and my classmates. I was a few weeks into my first semester of doctoral studies and realizing quickly how little theology I knew. The professor teaching the seminar on the Trinity was accomplished and formidable and could be forbidding when she wanted to be. No one wanted to say the wrong thing and make a fool of themselves. I forget now which, if any, of my classmates responded or what was said, but 30 years later, I remember my own utter lack of certainty and even direction and panic. Jesus, I thought to myself, well, the prayer certainly seems centered on him, and it's his own words which are at the heart of the prayer. The congregation, well, the priest is facing us and speaking to us. But I wasn't even remotely tempted to open my mouth and answer my formidable and even forbidding professor. I remember my relief and my surprise when she answered her own question saying, God the Father. Why was this doctoral student in systematic theology so ignorant about a fundamental liturgical reality? My poor theological and liturgical formation was one factor, obviously, as were my own incuriosity and laziness. I went to Mass as a child, but my main memory of the liturgy of the Eucharist was of the words of institution and the priest holding up to us the host and the chalice. To the extent that I paid attention to the Eucharistic prayers themselves, it was mostly to look at the pew missal and notice that Eucharistic prayer 1 was the longest and had all those saints' names, including Cosmas and Damian today, while Eucharistic prayers 3 and especially 2 were shorter. My aged, beat-up, rickety 9-year-old knees, being utterly tortured by the prospect of 4 to 5 minutes on a padded kneeler, were relieved when the priest chose the shorter prayer. I'd say now that my grad school confusion was due in large part to my sense that the Mass was basically a communal Thanksgiving meal. My first communion textbook in 1978-79 is this. I have my copy here. Can anybody tell me what the title of this book is? Well, some people have better vision. The title is We Celebrate the Eucharist. You can't really see the Eucharist on the title. I thought the title was We Celebrate. And it was only when I went back to prepare this talk and dug this out that I saw that the title was We Celebrate the Eucharist. Now, my main memory of the book was of drawing pictures of my family eating around our dinner table, which is a happy memory. I'm grateful for that. Nuns and our CCD teachers instructed us to receive the Eucharist standing and in the hand. Receiving on our knees or even just on our tongues was never presented as an option. More broadly, I don't remember seeing anyone of any age in my boyhood parish kneeling to receive communion, although some surely must have. Thanks be to God, though, I was given the gift of believing easily and immediately in the real presence. So Zwinglianism of any stripe was never appealing to me. And I need to add that the people who formed me for First Holy Communion were selfless, generous women doing their best as they saw it. Now, I say all of this not to indulge in a kind of cliched, caricatured diatribe against 1970s and 1980s liturgy, whether at my home parish or at my Catholic high school, but to underscore that there was little in my liturgical experience that indicated that Mass was supremely about worshiping God. I didn't think that the Mass was a mere secular meal. I had a clear sense, for instance, that the sanctuary in my parish was a special charged place that I generally shouldn't enter. And the altar rail, unused then and now sadly gone, helped with that. But the vertical and the eschatological were largely occluded. My unconscious assumption was that the priest was speaking to us during the Eucharistic prayer, but during the Mass, not least during the Eucharistic prayer. Later on in my theological formation, I was taught that Vatican II turned the priest around to face the people in order to foster a sense of community and active participation. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s and teaching theology that I realized that the tabernacles with big canopies over them in my boyhood and some subsequent parishes were actually the original altars of the church, on which the priest celebrated the holy sacrifice facing east. Joseph Ratzinger is the primary reason why I see things differently today. He kicked off for me a long, still ongoing process of rethinking how I saw liturgy, the church, and Christianity itself. If Father Robert Imbelli of Boston College is the one who taught me the simple but demanding truth that Christianity is about the person of Christ, it is Ratzinger who told me what liturgy is and why it is so important. Two quotations may be helpful for orienting us here. Now, some of these are on the handout that we have. These are words that will be familiar to many of you, and some have already cited them in papers. But this is from the introduction to his collected works on the liturgy. By Vatican II starting with the theme of liturgy, God's primacy, the absolute precedence of the theme of God was unmistakably highlighted. Beginning with the liturgy tells us God first. When the focus on God is not decisive, everything else loses its orientation. End quote. A second quote. Now, speaking of the post-conciliar liturgical reforms, Ratzinger writes in the preface to the Russian edition of his collected works that, quote, "The doings of men almost made us forget the presence of God. In such a situation, it became increasingly clear that the existence of the Church is vitally dependent on the correct celebration of the liturgy, and that the Church is in danger when the primacy of God no longer appears in liturgy and thus in life. The most profound reason for the crisis that upset the Church lies in the eclipse of God's priority in the liturgy." End quote. Ratzinger makes a remarkable, bold claim here, one that might seem hyperbolic and even dangerous. The eclipse of God's priority in the liturgy, he writes, is the most profound reason for the crisis in the Church today. Are these the words of a bookish, monkish man removed from real life? Do they betray a kind of aestheticism, a fussy fixation on liturgical exactitude? Even worse, do they reveal a self-absorption or an ecclesial introversion that avoids the pressing need for evangelization and diminishes the urgency of serving the poor and addressing injustice? Such a bold, radical claim on Ratzinger's part calls for a response. Now, you may not be surprised to hear that I share Ratzinger's view, but I hope to explain why I find it convincing. Today, I want to look at the roots of that eclipse of God's priority and suggest some ways forward for renewal. I'll proceed in 3 steps, and you can see that on the handout. First, the eclipse of God's priority in his thought in general. Secondly, in liturgy. And then third, some consequences and implications for us today. And I should make clear at the outset, I don't think there are any easy solutions or magic solutions or silver bullets, no one simple trick that will fix or cure our present liturgical and ecclesial challenges. Ratzinger himself would never have claimed to be an infallible guide. But 25 years after the publication of The Spirit of the Liturgy, his writings remain a light shining in the darkness. I'm convinced that those writings and his pontificate will age very well. In some ways, his day has yet to come. So, first section, the priority of God in Ratzinger's theology in general. If I had to single out what I consider Ratzinger's most important theological contribution, it would be something that might seem blindingly obvious, even banal. Christianity is about the person of Christ. Jesus is not just a great teacher or a supreme moral exemplar, though he is both of those. Rather, his very person is essential. We might readily think, for instance, of Benedict's words at the beginning of Deus Caritas Est. Quote, "Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction," end quote. Or these words from the Introduction to Christianity. Quote, "Someone who finds the way can forget Buddha, but with Jesus, what matters is precisely his person, Christ himself. The real message that he brings is not a doctrine, but his very person," end quote. And in Jesus of Nazareth, Ratzinger offers these beautiful but indicting words. Quote, this is on the handout, "What did Jesus actually bring, if not world peace, universal prosperity, and a better world? What has he brought? The answer is very simple: God. He has brought God. It is only because of the hardness of our hearts that we think this is too little." Jesus Christ, then, in his very person, reveals the priority of God. Ratzinger, as both theologian and hierarch, is an implacable opponent of Christological reductionism, of whatever reduces Jesus to something less than his full divine and full human identity, or someone who's dispensable once his teaching has been accepted. In Jesus of Nazareth, Ratzinger presents Jesus' temptations in the desert as perennial ones for people in any age. He suggests that these temptations share a common element. Quote, At the heart of all temptations is the act of pushing God aside because we perceive him as secondary, if not actually superfluous and annoying, in comparison with all the apparently far more urgent matters that fill our lives. End quote. That is, these temptations directly subvert the priority of God. Now, this temptation can be subtle. Ratzinger notes that we're usually not tempted directly to do evil, but to choose a seemingly better, more realistic and practical way. As he says, what's real is what's right there in front of us, power and bread. By comparison, the things of God fade into unreality, into a secondary world that no one really needs, end quote. Ratzinger sees this process at work in contemporary theological efforts, especially in social ethics and interreligious dialogue, that move first from a supposed narrow ecclesiocentrism to a supposedly broader Christocentrism. Soon, however, that Christocentrism must give way to a still broader theocentrism. But even this isn't enough, because theocentrism excludes polytheists and atheists. So the final step is a regnocentrism, a kingdom-centeredness, in which believers and alike can belong and contribute to the realization of the kingdom on earth. Ratzinger is too kind to mention it in Jesus of Nazareth, but this move received early classic expression in the American theologian Paul Nitter's writings. In 1987, Nitter argued, quote, "The absolute, that which all else must serve and clarify, is not the church or Christ or even God, but rather the kingdom and its justice," end quote. Now, Ratzinger notes that this regnocentric approach has the apparent merit of allowing for interreligious cooperation on peace, justice, and ecological concerns. It would seemingly open the way for all people to appreciate Jesus' message, but without requiring missionary evangelization of other religions. Ratzinger doesn't approve that, he just states that. It's a seeming win-win. You build a better world, you further the kingdom on earth, and you enable a non-triumphalist, non-colonialist, imperialist spread of Christian values. Now, besides noting the objection that the regnocentric model begs the question of what we mean by justice or peace, how we can know what they are, Ratzinger dryly but witheringly comments that, quote, "The main thing that leaps out is that God has disappeared. Man is the only actor left on the stage," end quote. Religion now matters only to the extent that it contributes to a better world. Ratzinger says that this post-Christian vision of faith and religion is, quote, "disturbingly close to Jesus' third temptation," end quote. In this context, it could be no surprise that the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, under the leadership of its then prefect, Cardinal Ratzinger, issued in 2000 its declaration Dominus Jesus, which in its number 19 criticized kingdom-centered approaches. Now, returning to Jesus' temptations in the desert, Ratzinger notes that Satan's challenge to Jesus is addressed to the church in every age. Quote, "If you claim to be the church of God, then start by making sure the world has bread. The rest comes later," end quote. Now, Ratzinger acknowledges that the cry of the hungry must pierce our souls. A danger arises, however, when the proper ordering of goods is rejected. And when we set God aside as a secondary matter, Ratzinger says, it is precisely the more important things that actually come to nothing. Whether it involves Marxism or Western development aid, he says, quote, "We think we could turn stones into bread. Instead, our aid has only given stones in place of bread. The issue is the primacy of God. The issue is acknowledging that he is a reality, that he is the reality without which nothing else can be good," end quote. He says elsewhere that the real and most profound problem with liberation theologies is their effective omission of the idea of God. And he says, not as though God has been denied, not on your life. He simply was not needed in regard to the reality that mankind had to deal with. God had nothing to do, end quote. A functional atheism, I think, is the inevitable result of Christological reductionism and the consequent inevitable deprioritization of God. Ratzinger, however, argues that this problem, the eclipse of the priority of God, runs much deeper than the 20th or even 19th century. It reaches centuries back into a growing sense that God is distant, irrelevant, impotent. One result is that Christian faith becomes to be regarded as something essentially subjective, restricted to the private sphere, irrelevant to the public one. In other words, we leave God with nothing left to do. This is the Deus otiosus, the idol God, as he puts it in the Feast of Faith. And on your handout, I have a long quote on here. I won't read all of it. But he says, "There is such a God," people thought, "but he is separated from man by an unbridgeable chasm. Since he has no power with regard to man, he cannot matter to him either. Thus, in a rational world where faith is reduced to rational monotheism, the notion of God simply fades away. It becomes irrelevant." But the retreat to a rationally presentable monotheism is always merely the first step. Next comes the abandonment of the relational categories of creation and revelation. Thus, God himself fades into the concept of transcendence. The possibility of prayer being heard dwindles, and faith becomes self-transcendence, end quote. This practical atheism is directly connected to the Christological reductionism that Ratzinger diagnosed and fought against. He comments that downplaying Jesus' divinity is not an act of humility before religious pluralism, but ironically ends up further distancing God from man in the world. Such apparently humble realism, he writes, is grounded in a sense of God's remoteness from the world. He says, if God is not in Christ, then he retreats into an immeasurable distance. He's no longer a God with us. If he's only a man, he's retreated irrevocably into the past. And third, I would say, the irony is that these deprioritizations of Christ, the reduction of Christ, and this kind of functional or practical atheism inescapably bring the abolition of man. When God is lost, man is too, as he writes. Concretely, when God is found, then man recovers himself and his relationships with other people. The difficulty, however, is that we struggle to see the importance of the priority of God. He says in a new song for the Lord, quote, "Today we are generally no longer capable of seeing that the matter of God is something most real. Indeed, the true key to our deepest human needs. This, however, shows how serious the sickness of our civilization is. Indeed, there will be no cure if God is not recognized as the structural core of our whole existence. Only in togetherness with God, being with God, does human life become real life," end quote. Now, Ratzinger ties all of these strands, these three strands that I've been mentioning, together in what I think is one of his most plaintive and piercing writings, which is the letter that he sent in March 2009 to the world's Catholic bishops in response to the outcry over his decision to lift the excommunication of the 4 SSPX bishops who had been illicitly consecrated by Archbishop Lefebvre. Benedict said there, and this is on the handout as well. He says, "In our days, in vast areas of the world, the faith is in danger of dying out like a flame which no longer has fuel. The overriding priority is to make God present in the world and to show men and women the way to God. Not just any God, but the God who spoke on Sinai. To that God whose face we recognize in a love which presses to the end, in Jesus Christ crucified and risen. The real problem at this moment of our history is that God is disappearing from the human horizon. And with the dimming of the light which comes from God, humanity is losing its bearings, with increasingly evident destructive effects. leading men and women to God, to the God who speaks in the Bible. This is the supreme and fundamental priority of the church and of the successor of Peter at the present time, end quote. Now, I think such words can seem blindingly obvious, something that should go without saying. Say, well, what else is a pope going to say? Focus on God. But yet we've seen in Ratzinger's analysis how this eclipse of God develops subtly, gradually, sometimes unconsciously. It recalls to me Ernest Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, where when a character is asked how he went bankrupt, he responds, 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. Attempts to make God more relatable, more practical, however well-intentioned, become fatal when they're detached from a truly Christocentric Trinitarian conception of God. When God is not first, when his priority is denied even in practice, then everything else is lost. The second part of the paper. I want to read this, but you can read it yourself. But I think in some ways this is the nut of the paper right here. The preface that the then Cardinal Ratzinger wrote for Alcuin Reed's book, The Organic Development of the Liturgy. It's a somewhat longer quote. It's on your handout. I think it's at the beginning of the handout. I'll just read part of it. This is Cardinal Ratzinger. The liturgy is not about us, but about God. Forgetting about God is the most imminent danger of our age. As against this, the liturgy should be setting up a sign of God's presence. Yet what happens if the habit of forgetting about God makes itself at home in the liturgy itself? If in the liturgy we're thinking only about of ourselves. In any and every liturgical reform and every liturgical celebration, the primacy of God should be kept in view first and foremost, end quote. That's the talk right there. We can maybe in some ways speed forward to Father Cashin's closing comments there, but I'll keep going. Liturgy is, or at least ought to be, the church's preeminent means of affirming the priority of God. This is why liturgy in which God is obscured or someone or something else is made central is so dangerous. And this forgetting is why Ratzinger could make that seemingly maybe over-the-top claim in the Russian edition to his collected works that the crisis in the liturgy is the deepest cause of the crisis in the church today. Now, in this section of my talk, I want to focus on the priority of God in Ratzinger's liturgical thought itself. Here it will probably be evident that I'm more of a systematic theologian than a liturgical one, so please bear with me on this. Now, I was struck when going back over the spirit of the liturgy that he doesn't seem to provide, Ratzinger doesn't, a single comprehensive definition of liturgy in this book. I kept searching for it. He would allude to it, he'd bring up different things, but I couldn't find like the single thing that he brought up. He variously describes liturgy soteriologically. It attempts to overcome guilt and bring back the world and one's own life into right order. Its fundamental intention is seeking peace in the universe through peace with God. He describes liturgy eschatologically. It, quote, gives us a share in heaven, end quote. He describes liturgy sacrificially. Real worship, he says, is the self-offering of the Son, who has become man and lamb, the firstborn who gathers up and into himself all the worship of God, takes from it the types and shadows of reality takes it from the types and shadows into the reality of man's union with God, end quote. And Ratzinger also sees liturgy as doxological. It involves not only what he calls cult, liturgy in the proper sense in his words, but the entirety of life. He says this, quote, ultimately, liturgy is the very life of man. Man himself is living righteously. that is the true worship of God. But life becomes real life only when it receives its form from looking toward God. Cult exists in order to communicate this vision and to give life in such a way that glory is given to God." End quote. So for Ratzinger, worship is soteriological, eschatological, sacrificial, as we saw yesterday with Professor Hoping, cosmological, and most deeply, doxological. Now, one of Ratzinger's key axial themes in his thought, whether in liturgy or in ecclesiology, we see this especially when he speaks about church reform, is the primacy of receiving over making. True liturgy is given by God, not made by men. The very purpose of the Exodus, as Ratzinger states at the beginning of Spirit of the Liturgy, is to worship God as he wants to be worshiped, as he tells us to worship him. And this leads to Israel's perennial temptation, idolatry. And I think this is one of the most striking aspects of Ratzinger's liturgical thought, is his subtle analysis of idolatry. He notes that the Israelites' worship of the golden calf was a subtle form of apostasy, but it lacked an overt denial of God. They wanted to glorify the God who had freed them from the Egyptians, and they weren't intending to serve false gods. Their worship was orderly and rubrically correct, and yet they fell into idolatry and apostasy, even if, in Ratzinger's words, quote, "outwardly it is scarcely perceptible," end quote. Why? How does this idolatry happen? First, Ratzinger notes that the Israelites bring God down to themselves rather than themselves going up to God. Unable to cope with a God who is seemingly invisible, remote, and mysterious, they create a manageable, tangible substitute and seek to use God for their own purposes, thereby placing themselves above him. They're literally trying to manipulate God with their hands. They demand that God prove himself and deliver visible results. Second, their worship of the golden calf is self-generated self-affirmation. Unable to bear the apparent absence of God, they attempt to force him back, to bring him back through worship of their own devising. Their worship thus becomes, quote, "a feast that the community gives itself, a festival of self-affirmation," end quote. Their eating and drinking are signs of self-seeking worship, banal self-gratification, a circle closed in on himself. Those are all quotes. What began with perhaps seemingly good intentions, and Ratzinger's being generous, I think, to the Israelites here, ends in his damning words with this, quote, "apostasy in sacral disguise. All that is left in the end is frustration, a feeling of emptiness. There is no experience of that liberation which always takes place when man encounters the living God," end quote. Idolatry, then, is false worship because it instrumentalizes or uses God and closes the worshiper off from God. I think of the image that Jean-Luc Marion would speak about, the difference between an idol and an icon. That when you look at an icon, your gaze passes through the icon into the reality, whereas the idol stops your gaze. You look at the idol, but your gaze stops there, whereas the icon you pass through. Idolatry is human-centered control and self-absorption, rather than divine-centered surrender and self-transcendence. Idolatry denies the priority of God by its impatience with God's silence and otherness, and its subsequent decision to get results. It's a literal fabrication, as with the golden calf, of liturgy, rather than receiving it as a gift from God. In short, idolatry says man first, not God first. Now, I'm convinced that Ratzinger's, and this is something that grew on me as I was working on this paper, began to be convinced that Ratzinger's long-standing, sometimes controversial advocacy for ad orientem worship is directly connected with his warnings against idolatry. Beginning to see this link coming out more clearly to me. Maybe some of you have seen it for a long time, but the dots started coming together for me. He says that ad orientem worship is neither just a matter of taste, a matter of something accidental, but of what is essential. Those are his words. And he notes that the Spirit of the Liturgy's chapter on liturgical orientation was so controversial that he considered omitting it from a subsequent edition, so that the book's other concerns could get a better hearing than he thought they were getting. But the fact that he didn't do so, I think, indicates its fundamental importance for his liturgical theology. I know that it'll be quite familiar to many of you here, but I think it's important to present briefly some of Ratzinger's rationale for ad orientem worship. He says that praying towards the east is a tradition that goes back to the beginning. In other words, it's an apostolic tradition. He states that very directly in several places. And I would add here that even some liturgical scholars favorably disposed towards versus populum worship, such as the Jesuit John Baldwin, admit that there's no historical foundation in the early church, let alone the later church, for habitual versus populum worship. Its rationale must be found somewhere else than in the church's tradition. Ratzinger traces in Christian worship the move from Jewish worship to Christian worship, from synagogue to church. And he says that Christians no longer face Jerusalem and the temple, but east. The east is where the sun rises, the Son of Christ. This is all familiar to many of us. And something that Professor Hoping addressed in his keynote yesterday. Second, unlike synagogues, the Christian churches contain an altar on which the Eucharistic sacrifice is offered. And for Ratzinger, the altar signifies God's entry into the community and humanity's exodus from what he calls the prison of this world, a participation in the Pasch, the passing over from this world to God. The altar in the apse, he notes, both looks towards the Oriens, the east, and forms part of it. And he says, we might put it this way: the altar is the place where heaven is opened up. It does not close off the church, but opens it up and leads it into the eternal liturgy. End quote. Eastward-facing worship thus highlights the liturgy's orientation towards the cosmos, to creation, to the future, to the cross, and thus to both sacrifice and the second coming. And in doing so, I think ad orientem worship can help us overcome a closed or cramped anthropocentric view of the world and of liturgy. As Ratzinger puts it, quote, looking at the priest has no importance. What matters is looking together at the Lord. It is not now a question of dialogue, but of common worship, of setting off toward the one who is to come, end quote. Ad orientem worship, I think, speaks unmistakably of God's priority. Protology, eschatology, and the cross all cohere seamlessly in it. By contrast, Ratzinger says, versus populum worship, often seen as, quote, the characteristic fruit of Vatican II's liturgical renewal, quote, brings with it a new idea of the essence of liturgy, the liturgy as a communal meal, end quote. It then becomes necessary for the priest and the people to face each other. The sadder irony, though, as he notes, is that this orientation towards the people makes the priest the center of everything, which then necessitates that laity be given liturgical roles to offset that priest-centeredness. You're trying to create a problem that you have caused in some ways. As he says, this is a quote, less and less is God in the picture. More and more important is what is done by the human beings who meet here, end quote. This kind of worship facing the people thus no longer opens out to what lies ahead and above, but is closed in on itself. These are Ratzinger's words. And this is one of Ratzinger's two characteristics of idolatry. And now it's true that Ratzinger acknowledges that both ad orientem and versus populum worship can and must be ordered ad deum, but it would be hard to avoid the conclusion that Ratzinger sees versus populum doing so only with difficulty and with a certain artificiality or extrinsicism. For instance, the Benedictine arrangement in which an upright crucifix is placed at the altar's center point, whereas ad orientem intrinsically, visually, and effortlessly, I think, conveys a Godward focus, the priority of God. It speaks without saying a single word. And I think that's the single most effective means of conveying that priority of God. And without it, liturgy limps and risks falling into a horizontalism that obscures God's priority. Now, certainly ad orientem is not the only way that this priority can be manifested. The Spirit of the Liturgy speaks about a number of other kind of gestures in the section on liturgy and the body: bowing, kneeling, prostrations, incense, purifications. These acts mean nothing, or very, very close to nothing, in a horizontal understanding of liturgy. Who are you bowing to? Who are you prostrate before? Why are you incensing? It's not the community. It's only because God. It's only because of God. These are all important, but I think ad orientem is the symbol that speaks of this divine priority. Now, I want to pivot to the final section of this paper, and I'm trying to remember if it's on the handout or not. But when he was speaking to the Eastern Catholic Churches a few days into his pontificate, Pope Leo XIV said, quote, "The Church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense." He goes on and says, "We need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies, that sing of the beauty of salvation, evoke a sense of wonder, of how God's majesty embraces our frailty." And then Leo continues and he says, "It's likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, a sense of the primacy of God." And then he then goes on to speak of other things as well. But I find it significant that the first thing that Leo mentions that the West needs is a recovery of the primacy of God in its worship. This is a few days into his pontificate. He's speaking of very important things here. He knows, in this sense, what is being communicated. People are analyzing every syllable that he's saying at this point, how he's saying it. So the fact that he says this, I think, is very important. The fact that he makes it first is significant. And I think that this is a subtle but profound critique of much Western liturgy. Speaking from my own experience of Eastern liturgies, I would say that they are unmistakably, overwhelmingly God-centered. You are very aware that God is present and that he is being worshiped. Now, the Christian West, of course, has abundant resources of its own. We don't look east, for those of us who are Western Christians, we don't look east as a beggar seeking what we don't have, but rather to be reminded of our own treasures. The East and the West are brothers in this. We have a much deeper commonality than we realize, and we've allowed, I think, in the West, that commonality to diminish in recent years. So following Ratzinger, I would say that the Christian West has the task of making the Christian thing, the priority of God, visible and plausible again. And let me suggest 4 possible routes. First, unsurprisingly, given my prior comments, I think is a vastly broader use of ad orientem worship. We see in the work of Stephen Hyde and our own Father Michael Lang how deeply rooted eastward liturgy is in the Christian tradition. Father Michael, for instance, has noted how the Oxford movement in the 19th century, in its desire, it had a desire to retrieve eastward-facing worship as an essential part of its desire to reconnect Anglicanism to the broader Catholic tradition, particularly the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist and of liturgy as a Godward act. These are words you can find in Father Michael's Turning to the Lord. Conversely, we see how some Protestant reformers sought to introduce versus populum worship, at least partly in an effort to deny the sacrificial nature of Christian worship. I now think that a return to ad orientem isn't just desirable, but is essential for liturgical and ecclesial renewal. How that renewal is to happen is one thing, but that it must happen seems incontrovertible to me. I mentioned earlier that the Spirit of the Liturgy, its chapter on liturgical orientation, was so controversial that Ratzinger thought of dropping it. But I'm glad that he kept it, of course. But I think that Ratzinger's critics were right to hone in on it. I think that chapter is, in a certain sense, the key one. In one sense, I think the first three chapters are the foundation. Those are the ones that personally, for me, totally helped me see liturgy in a whole new way than I had ever thought of it before. But this chapter on orientation is where it sort of comes together, or where it starts really working in a certain way. And I think that Ratzinger's critics are right to hone into it. They grasp its significance. Because ad orientem, more than anything else, is a condensed symbol, a reproach to man-centered liturgy. And his critics, I think, rightly perceive this, which is why some bishops have effectively banned its use, even in the Missal of Paul VI. I'm not making any news here by saying that. I know this is a familiar thing, but it bears repeating. And I think it's why appeals for legitimate liturgical diversity and accommodation and generosity fail. Ad orientem is the proverbial camel's nose under the tent. It's the gateway drug, if you will. Once people learn more about the history and theology of liturgical orientation, a lot of uncomfortable questions begin to arise. I believe that there is much more support for ad orientem worship, or at least lack of resistance to it, than is sometimes thought, especially among younger clergy and laity. And I'm convinced that with proper congregational preparation and even the slightest episcopal backing, initial efforts to do so would spread. Prudence and confidence are both needed. And I think some ways with this that it sometimes seems like, how do you even get to a position where this could be more widespread given the current state of reality? And I think of that line from Hemingway, and I apologize, this is untoward, but I think of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It seemed like it was never going to come down, and then it came down overnight. The fall of my freshman year in college, the Berlin Wall came down. I never would have imagined that. Now, let me be clear, as a former president would say, let me be clear. I'm not calling into question versus populum worship as legitimate, as valid at all. I attend Mass in that hundreds of times a year. So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that I think that there's much more open to this. And I think all it takes is a little bit going somewhere, someplace. And I think this momentum will build. That's my hope. Secondly, a recovery of ad orientem worship is directly connected to a recovery of the sense that our earthly liturgies are entrances into and a sharing in the angelic, heavenly, eternal liturgy. Now, such heavenly worship is, of course, a characteristic of the Eastern churches, but Western Christianity has its long heritage of this as well. The Romanesque, the Gothic, the Baroque, all in their respective ways make clear in art, architecture, music, that our earthly assemblies are enveloped within the heavenly assembly. Sacred art, architecture, and decoration make the invisible visible, and sacred music can create conditions by which visual beauty can be more fully apprehended. Just think of our liturgy yesterday afternoon, how extraordinary that was. I think many here will recall Ratzinger's famous saying that saints and art are the two most effective apologies for the Christian faith. Now, theologically, chapters 7 and 8 of Lumen Gentium, which I think are still so almost criminally neglected in Vatican II studies, have a lot to teach us about what the 7th chapter of Lumen Gentium calls the Church's intimate vocation, section number 51 of Lumen Gentium. That intimate vocation is the praise of the Most Holy Trinity and the mutual love of believers. This is the Church's deepest essence, even here on earth. What will the Church be doing in heaven for all eternity? Praising God and loving each other. That's it. There's no more evangelization. There's no more service. There's no more ministries in one sense. It's the praise of God and mutual love. And Lumen Gentium 51 says that this intimate vocation, the deepest part of the Church's identity, is accessible even here and now. And Ratzinger himself has spoken eloquently of this interplay of heaven and earth with a beautiful passage that's on your handout from his visit in 2007 to Heiligenkreuz Abbey in Austria. And he speaks here about, I won't read the whole thing, but he says, we see here a liturgy completely centered on God, on eternity. Here the architecture itself draws our senses upwards, towards what eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart, of man imagined. In all our efforts on behalf of the liturgy, the determining factor must always be our looking to God. You go on. It's a fuller passage, but I'll just read that. I just focus on that part. In a similar way, Father John Sayward, the English translator of the Spirit of the Liturgy, has recently written a gem of a book on the angels entitled World Invisible. Father Sayward argues persuasively that attention to the angels should not be an esoteric or marginal exercise in the Christian life, but it should be one that should deepen our worship of God, our understanding of the human person as both body and soul, and of our hope for eternal life. The angels, Father Sayward tells us, reveal to us that all of creation is filled with divine presence. That, as C.S. Lewis put it in The Discarded Image, a principle of plenitude governs the entire universe. A principle of plenitude governs the entire universe. Third, our grasp of this invisible realm, this world invisible in John Sayward's phrase, which he takes from the poet Francis Thompson, has been made much more difficult by our increasingly constricted grasp of reality itself. We find it increasingly hard to perceive what is invisible. In Introduction to Christianity, Ratzinger even goes so far as to say that, quote, the distance between the visible and the invisible is the primary stumbling block to belief, end quote. Ratzinger has long criticized our modern constriction or hardening of human reason to what is visible, empirical, material. The Regensburg Address, with its critique of the modern self-limitation of reason and its call to have the courage to engage the whole breadth of reason, I think is the most famous or prominent example of his call for a more ample sense of reason. But it's not the only run. It runs throughout his writing from beginning to end. His first lecture as a professor at Bonn in 1959 was on the God of faith and the God of the philosophers. It's right there from the beginning. So what I think we need now is a more capacious sense of seeing and of knowing. We must recover a more contemplative sense of reality. Ratzinger himself speaks in Introduction to Christianity of, quote, a decisive enlargement of our whole view of the world, where what cannot be seen, in fact, represents true reality, end quote. We need the eyes of faith, and we need the eyes of a broader reason. As I argued earlier, Ratzinger identified a number of elements that led to the diminishment and eclipse of God in favor of a deus otiosus, an idol god. His writings find a useful complement in those of Michael Buckley, the late American Jesuit, and the late Belgian Louis Dupré. Michael Buckley's At the Origins of Modern Atheism argues convincingly that Christian thinkers, in trying to counter the rise of atheism, actually contributed to it by bracketing revelation as epistemologically irrelevant. This is a kind of own goal in soccer terms, or for Father James' sake, football terms. Similarly, Louis Dupre wrote of how what he called the ontotheological synthesis of God, cosmos, and nature, human person, was shattered by what he calls, quote, the combustive mixture of, quote, humanistic conceptions of human creativity and of nominalistic theology. Nominalism, in Dupre's account, effectively removes God from his creation, thereby destroying the ontotheological synthesis and contributing to a growing disjunction between the natural and the supernatural, the religious and the secular. God is relegated to the margins, deprioritized because he's irrelevant. I think liturgically one can see a rough analog in Jeffrey Hull's The Banished Heart, which locates a certain liturgical decline in the West corresponding to the rise of a certain kind of rationalism in the later Middle Ages. I know that's a controversial book in a number of ways, but I have found it very, very thought-provoking and very stimulating. Ratzinger himself, I think, has two approaches that can counter this effacement of God that we see Buckley and Dupre outlining. First, he suggests that in a world that leads even believers to live as if God doesn't exist, et si Deus non daretur, believers should invite unbelievers to live as if he does. I think that this option, a variation on Pascal's wager, will become more plausible and inviting as our culture experiences ever more desperately the radical, literal nihilism of a post-Christian and post-theistic world. I'm haunted by those recent mass shootings, the recent shootings in Minneapolis, in the country, that the absolute darkness, the literal nihilism that you can see in those shooters. This is not just madness, this is demonic. There's nihilism, this is nothing there. Christian communities, I think, however small, can offer an appealing, visible witness of a more humane and divine way of life. This, of course, is Ratzinger's famous prophecy of the church of the future. Quote, men in a totally planned world will find themselves unspeakably lonely. If they have completely lost sight of God, they will feel the whole horror of their poverty. Then they will discover the little flock of believers as something wholly new. They will discover it as a hope that is meant for them, for which they have always been searching in secret, end quote. And the church herself, Ratzinger says in the future, will be called to rediscover in faith and prayer, quote, her true center and experience the sacraments again as the worship of God and not as a subject for liturgical scholarship, end quote. Second, Ratzinger emphasizes what he terms Christian positivity, the irreducibly historical and particular reality of, quote, a God who has come so near to us that we can kill him, end quote. Argument and scholarship have their place, but simply presenting people with the irreducible particulars of Christianity, particularly in liturgy, is called for. We mustn't reduce Christianity to a bland moralism or a beige Catholicism, to use Bishop Barron's phrase. In place of a Christianity that no longer offends anyone, as Ratzinger puts it in Introduction to Christianity, the present moment may be calling for practices and approaches that are unafraid to be strange, unfamiliar, demanding, otherworldly, rather than comfortable and familiar. This, I think, is part, not all, but part of what's drawing many younger Christians to more traditional forms of worship. The mysterium tremendum and fascinans needs to come to the fore, liturgically above all. And finally, these various constrictions or contractions of the eschatological, the spiritual, the rational, are symptoms of what Ian McGilchrist in The Master and His Emissary and his other writings has called the modern dominance, even the dictatorship of the left brain. Our thinking, our seeing, our experience of reality has been profoundly mutated and deformed. There are dimensions of access through, you might say, our left brain dominance as opposed to our right brain. As McGilchrist says, the right brain should be the master. The left brain should be the emissary. The left brain is sort of seeing right brain is seeing a bigger picture. The left brain is seeing in some ways details. But we're finding it harder, McGilchrist says, to even experience certain dimensions of reality. We can't even grasp that they're there. Think of that acronym, WEIRD, W-E-I-R-D. Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. That's our worldview. There are things that we literally cannot see that sometimes people in other cultures can see because our minds have been shaped in certain particular ways to grasp reality. So in this sense, we've been addicted to certain ways of thinking that have now been turbocharged by screens, particularly smartphones, which I think are killing our brains and killing our attention spans. I see this every day in my classrooms. I see it in my daily life. So these are some ways in which the priority of God can be recovered and fostered. Over 80 years ago, C.S. Lewis wrote in Mere Christianity, "Aim at heaven, and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth, and you will get neither heaven nor earth." We mustn't settle for less than heaven and heaven's God. And 25 years after its publication, the spirit of the liturgy and Ratzinger's corpus as a whole, I think, is still ahead of its time. But having taught a graduate course on Ratzinger for 15 years now, I can say confidently that his time is coming. Time and again, my students, whether they be priests, seminarians, laity alike, single out the spirit of the liturgy as the book of Ratzinger's that has most shaped their life, their thought, their ministry. So many say that they never really understood what liturgy was meant to be until they read it. And at the heart of that book and his entire liturgical legacy is his insistence that God be first. That priority of God is so simple, so seemingly obvious and banal, and yet so difficult to honor and practice. Ratzinger has planted the mustard seed, and much toil and labor remain, but we see the abundant fruit that it has already begun to bear. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for presenting to us in a characteristically systematic and irenic way this central theme in Ratzinger's work, and also for helping us to understand its practical implications, recovery of the priority of God in Christian worship, which was not only a call of Benedict XVI, but as you noted, has already been intimated by Pope Leo. I couldn't help but notice the excellent banners either side of the stage which emphasize that point. But this is surely also at the heart of our society, which I hope can exist as a community exhibiting, again, as you said, a more humane and divine way of life. So thank you very much indeed. Professor Ruddy has kindly agreed to take some questions, and we have until 2:45 p.m. when we'll move directly into our conference's closing remarks. As before, if I could ask that we please introduce ourselves before asking our questions and wait for the microphone to arrive. I'll kind of point at people, and my energetic friend here will run around with the mic. Thanks.
Father Daniel Cardo from St. John Vianney Seminary in Denver. Thank you, Christopher. That was really, really beautiful. I would like to ask a question not only about the liturgical contribution of Ratzinger, but you mentioned that you see in your students a growing appreciation for Ratzinger's contribution, and I, of course, wholeheartedly agree that his time is coming. Do you have any impressions in general about his reception in academia with colleagues? Do you think this is also a generational kind of divide in some way, and any ideas about how his presence can grow in Catholic academia?
Well, I can plug my own university here and say that I'm fortunate to have many colleagues who are very much engaged with Ratzinger's work in its various dimensions. And so I'm very grateful for that. We have grad students who are interested in it. In the broader academy, I think there are some aspects of Ratzinger that won't be dated, but he's definitely writing in a context in which liberal religion or liberal theology, von Harnack and others, are a dominant interlocutor for him. I don't think that will be as pressing going forward. Some of the issues that he was dealing with are not necessarily the front burner ones today, but I think his resolutely God-centered approach, and particularly his Christocentric approach, are finding it appealing. I'm teaching a graduate course on him this semester, and that's always an easy course to teach because the students are engaged and they'll eat it up. I'm teaching undergrads this semester a course on Ratzinger for the first time. And that's a different thing because they're in different places and asking different questions. But I find that Jesus of Nazareth speaks to them very well, and it raises questions. So I think there is a future for that, a big one. I think more broadly, I think Catholic theology is moving towards an era where you might say it's going to be increasingly, it's going to sound like a tautology, it's either going to be increasingly ecclesial and traditional, or it's going to be non-ecclesial and non-traditional. The way I see American Catholic theological education shaping up is there are places that are on a trajectory to becoming, these would be my words, effectively post-Christian or non-Christian. And there are other schools in which the Christian tradition is continuing to be appropriated more deeply. And I'm not saying this just to plug my own institution, but I think we do a very good job of that here. And I think that's attractive to people.
Hi, Father Sam Keys, Ordinary at Chair St. Peter. So I want to just preface my question, just your comment about reading Spirit of the Liturgy with your students reminds me of my first read of that book when I was an Anglican in grad school, and I loved it, and also wasn't sure where I could see that vision in the Catholic Church that I was seeing around me. So that's kind of an impatience that I had. You know, it took me some years from that to actually become Catholic. But in any case, I was thinking about you kind of made an offhand comment about versus populum worship and how it's obviously legitimate and valid and so on, and we always say that, right? It's everybody kind of we have to jump to that and say, oh, I'm not saying this other thing, which other people might say, because that's just kind of the world we're in, and we need to kind of offer that defense at times. But I wonder if, you know, it strikes me as there's a kind of culture of the bare minimum where we so focus on what's kind of, what do we have to do, what's kind of valid, and there's a kind of satisfaction with just the basic things that we need, as opposed to thinking about the better things that actually we're called to. And I guess I wonder if you're kind of, the way that you're describing Ratzinger's priority of God, and actually I think of that last quote that you gave from C.S. Lewis about, you know, aiming for heaven, you know, as opposed to aiming for something lower, like, you know, the bare minimum required for validity. You know, is that, I guess maybe you could comment on that, or think about that kind of culture of the bare minimum, and how we might move beyond that, following Joseph Ratzinger.
Well, I mean, on one level, I think everyone here in this room is here because liturgy is really important to them and really meaningful. I think for a lot of Christians, it isn't in the same way. And part of me says I want to change that. Another part of me says different people have different gifts or orientations with that. All Christians are called to be liturgical and to worship. That's not what I'm questioning. But some people are going to be more into it or less into it. And we need to respect that not everybody is moved or drawn to God in the same exact ways as we are. But having said that, I think that this is a very Ratzingerian thing, is I think just think of mustard seeds. So those people who are concerned about it, to do what they can and to build up communities of worship with this. The obvious place for this, for me at least, is monastic life. Monasticism is essential. A Benedictine friend of mine who's a bishop and an abbot says that the health of religious life in general, and of monasteries in particular, is a barometer of the church as a whole. And that in this sense, when monasteries are places that are putting God first, I mean, if monks and nuns don't put God first, what are they even doing? And so they need to be good with this, to be putting the work of God in the first place. They need to do what they can, and then be a witness that can draw in the vocation, other vocations to monastic life or religious life in general, and then also for the lay people who can be brought into that and drink from it. That's a first step. Secondly, I think you can have smaller communities. Today, in the life of the Roman Catholic Church, I would say some of these can be more traditionally oriented communities, whether they're FSSP parishes or ICK or diocesan sort of just TLMs, whether they're the ordinariates, that these places can be places where people can see what worship can be. Like, I didn't even know, a liturgy like I went to yesterday, I didn't even know that was even possible for like decades of my life. I didn't even know that's what you were trying to do. I never saw that growing up, ever. And so I think, even if it's just small ways, small communities can be the means by which we're building. I think that's what Ratzinger was about. He wasn't into legislation, and sometimes I wish he did more with that. But in another sense, he's doing the crock pot way of heating things up, not the microwave. The microwave heats things up quickly and they dry out and they get hard. The crock pot builds up slowly, but then over time, it releases that. That's what I'm confident about. And I see those seeds already. I see it in ordinary parishes where the pastor or the vicar or whomever is trying in their own way with whatever resources they have to celebrate more reverently. That has an effect. The situation is much different today than it was when I was in graduate school 30 years ago. It's a very different thing, and that gives me a lot of hope. So let's focus on these small communities, and let's things build from there. So thank you for that question.
Just one
Yeah.
more question. One more question.
Yeah.
I hope I don't blow with like a bad question as the last one. Matthew Book from Denver and St. John Vianney Seminary. I've always just been struck by just the way Ratzinger thinks and writes and weaves things together, and Spirit of the Liturgy is certainly a beautiful example. And I wonder if you could speak to us, given your broader experience with Ratzinger, just methodologically, what can we learn from him about thinking about the liturgy, thinking theologically, and that could kind of equip our association, with just some of the ways that he approaches things. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. You might say sort of remote preparation for that is being liturgical, going to monasteries, living a more contemplative and prayerful life, praying, immersing yourself in Scripture. That's the foundation for any Christian, obviously. But that's the context in which I think really good scholarship can emerge. It's the only context in which it can really emerge. You can be smart without doing that, but to be wise and to really have that sense when you read Ratzinger, you're like, this is not just a smart person. This is someone who can tell me how to live. He can be trusted. He's beyond intelligent, but I think that's important, that the preparation is important. Then to be good in your scholarly work. There are no shortcuts. You have to work. You have to learn languages. You have to read. You have to write papers. You have to get out and talk. So there's no shortcuts on that. And from what I can gather, Ratzinger knew how to work. And so I think that's important. And to realize that you're not starting from scratch. You're standing in the midst of a community of believers that exists across the centuries, who you can draw from, who are your contemporaries. And then from that, your own theological contribution will begin to emerge, I think. So, thank you.
Thanks. Clark would be live. Or his exit. Clark, go on.
George, totally thanks.